Exclusive polling. You look at the EWTN News Real Clear Opinion Research poll on the faithful and their attitudes leading to the 2020 presidential election, including how Catholics view the president and examining the issues most important to Catholics. On a special edition of EWTN News Nightly for Friday, December 27th, 2019. Good evening, I'm Jason Calvi. EWTN News Nightly this month revealed results of an in-depth look at American Catholic voters. EWTN News partnered with Real Clear Opinion Research for exclusive polling ahead of the 2020 presidential election. Tonight, Wyatt Goolsby looks at the numbers.
Joining me now are Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at Real Clear Opinion Research, and Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor for EWTN News. Welcome to all of you. I want to get started with you, Matthew. Tell me overall here, what was the purpose of this survey? Why did EWTN News want to do this?
Well, if EWTN News is going to serve the church and inform Catholics everywhere about the events in the world and where we are as a church in the United States, we need to have a very clear idea of where Catholics stand politically, but also how Catholics are living their life and where they're living their life. And so we see this as part of a service to American Catholicism, but also to the Universal Church. But we also see this as a kind of diagnostic tool, as a way of understanding where are the crisis points in the Church in the United States. And once we have that kind of diagnosis, it's going to be up to the experts and church leaders to come up with prescriptions for where we go forward from here.
And it is a very interesting survey. John, I want to ask you, there's so many politicians over the years that talk about wanting to get the Catholic vote. They want to get out there and get those voters. But based on all this information that we now have, is there such a thing as a Catholic vote?
Absolutely. And it's one of the most critical building blocks, I think, of any winning coalition. In fact, for most elections over the last 50 years or so, the one group that has been most predictive of the popular vote winner has been Catholics. So understanding, tuning in to what Catholics think about politically is critical for any successful campaign, especially in a general election. Overall, the Catholic vote represents about almost a quarter, 22 to 24 or so percent of all votes cast. And we'll get into it a little bit later, but there are constituencies within that voter block as well, so it's not a monolith. But there is most certainly a Catholic vote. That vote in 2016 mirrored the popular vote almost perfectly.
Very interesting. So Carl, to follow up on that, what do you think are the biggest takeaways from the poll, and especially as we look ahead into this new election year?
Well, I'd say two things. And the first is, just following on what John said, devout Catholics are very much still with this president and with the Republican Party, but they're with Donald J. Trump. And, that it mirrors, this poll shows, it's the mirror image of what's going on in the evangelical church, in the Protestant church, which is where the mainstream Protestants and the younger Protestants are less likely to be Republicans. But evangelical Christians who are devout, who go to church regularly or identify themselves as evangelicals, they're a powerful voting bloc. If you combine them with these devout Catholics who go to Mass once a week or more, now you're talking about a coalition. Maybe we ought to be talking about the Christian vote in journalism and political science, because that's the thing that most struck me about this. But the other thing is, and this, if you're a Democrat, this would be in your favor. The Republicans don't have an unlimited number of election cycles. Next year might be the last one where they can, with the status quo the way it is, because younger Catholics, like younger non-Catholics, are less likely to be Republican, less likely to be liberal, or less likely to be conservative on these issues, and less likely to support the president. So those two takeaways struck me.
It is interesting to look about some of the changing demographics there. John, was there anything in terms of this data that surprised you or stood out to you?
I do think the changing demographics, and to add some more to that, is the difference between the generations. Difference between the generations is significant, and for the first time, we'll have more younger Americans, younger Catholics voting than older Catholics voting in 2020. So that's something that's worth keeping an eye on as well. But this is the first of a series of polls that will be conducted over the next year, and this is essentially kind of a baseline to understand kind of where the Catholic vote is today, where the similarities are with the overall general electorate, generally, where the differences are, where the similarities are, and how the vote kind of emerges and changes, if it does, over the next year or so. And we have a lot more questions to ask.
Sure.
Well, and one thing too that this poll tends to confirm, so it's less of a surprise as much as it is a confirmation of the rising influence of Latino Catholics on American Catholicism. 37% in this poll. We know that any sort of factoring in of where the Catholic vote is going to go, now we have to pay very close attention to Latino Catholics.
And like you said, that's so consistent with what we've talked about on this program. So John, you are confident about the accuracy of this survey.
Of course, and to make sure that we're accurately representing 37% of Catholics, we conducted the poll in English as well as in Spanish, because oftentimes, people are more comfortable with one language tend to answer questions differently than others. So we did that. This includes, several thousand registered voters. We oversample Catholics. We're able to look at Catholics based on gender, based on age, based on race and ethnicity, et cetera. And again, this is just a snapshot in time. But what is unique about this poll is it's over 100 questions long, but it's less about what's happening today in terms of predicting the election and more about the underlying issues and values of this vote and how those, I think, will ultimately be kind of a lens of which we hope that the audience as well as candidates can kind of connect with them.
We're going to continue to talk more about the survey in the coming days, so I want to thank you all for being here. Matthew Bunson, John Della Volpe, Carl Cannon, thank you all so much.
Coming up, more from our exclusive polling, including analysis of how Catholics view President Donald Trump.
Welcome back. We're looking at what Catholic voters think ahead of 2020. The polling comes from EWTN News Real Clear Opinion Research. Next, Wyatt Goolsby tells us about how Catholics feel about President Donald Trump and where the president stacks up against his 2020 rivals.
Join me now are Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at Real Clear Opinion Research, and Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor for EWTN News. All are back with us tonight. John, we are less than a year out from the presidential election. Where do Catholics stand in terms of their views on President Donald Trump?
Overall, when you look at the Catholic vote overall, they mirror in many ways the general electorate at the highest level. For example, 42% of the general electorate approve of his job performance, 44% of Catholics say the same. So that's consistent. When we look at Catholics who are likely Democratic primary voters Democratic primary voters, the president is trailing against each of the major candidates on the Democratic side. So he's at that sort of disadvantage at that stage. However, things change when we ask what we call kind of a traditional re-elect question in terms of on a scale from 1 to 5, how likely are you to vote for the president? So while he's trailing today relative to the top Democratic challengers, that could certainly change over the course of the next several months.
And Carl, let me have you jump in here and also reiterate your thoughts on that same subject. The survey data shows Donald Trump's currently behind the Democratic candidates. How else can you explain that?
Well, look, you don't want to spin it. If you're the Republicans, you'd rather be ahead than behind. However, history of recent elections, going back all the way to 1980, show us what's going on now in the polls isn't always determined what's going to happen. And one reason is, think the limits of polling are horse race questions a year out. That's the outer limit of the science, because if you think about it, every question to a voter begins with a lie at this point. And the lie is said by the pollster. And the lie is, if the election were held today, who would you vote for? Well, the voters know darn well it's not held today. And so they got a year, first of all, to make up their minds. Secondly, send some messages to us, we in the elites in Washington or the political parties. And so it's not, they're not bound by that, what they say. Elections have a dynamic. And this one's going to be a bare knuckles affair. Because we know this because the last one was, and how whoever the Democratic nominee handles himself or herself vis-a-vis Donald Trump, and we know he'll handle himself. He'll be aggressive in his own cause. So that dynamic also will change people's minds.
Yeah. John, do you want to follow up
Yeah,
on that?
when you break down the numbers, 34%, about a third of all Catholics are definitely going to vote for Trump, according to what they say a year out, right? Number one. 10% say there's a strong chance, a good chance. So that's 44%. That number in that re-elect question looks exactly like his job approval numbers. You have roughly the same number who are definitely going to vote against him and are most likely to vote against him. What's most interesting, I think, about this poll is who are those 9%? The 9% who are possibly going to vote for him. And really, I think that 9% is going to sit back and wait a little bit and decide whether it's going to be Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren or Sanders or whoever the nominee might be. That 9% wants to wait and to see what the options are.
Matthew, I want to follow up with you on another issue here when we look at some of the data, because practicing or active Catholics differ significantly in their voting patterns from Catholics who do not practice their faith to the same degree or on a regular basis. So how do we think of the Catholic voting bloc when we think of this kind of big differential?
Well, 58% of the Catholics who responded consider themselves faithful to all or most of the teachings of the Church. Of that, 17% consider themselves faithful to all teachings, 41% to most. That itself forms a kind of a block here that has consistently proven two things. One, they vote aggressively. They are consistent in voting in elections. The other is that they stand apart basically from the rest of the Catholic population, where the Catholic population in those other categories tend to reflect the national averages. This group does not. They are supporting President Trump, as we have mentioned before. This group, for example, supports him, I think, with 43% right now for his reelect. These are very strong numbers, and it's one of the reasons why they're holding up Trump's numbers among Catholics.
John, to follow up on that, you've talked about how important it is to remember that Catholic votes, the Catholic voters, are not a monolithic group.
Right.
According to the poll, Hispanic Catholics comprise 37% of the Catholic vote, and there are key differences among the age groups as well. Reiterate to me the big differences there.
Within the Hispanic category, you have, as Matthew mentioned, you have those who are more devout and less devout in terms of the way in which they're practicing their faith, which is another factor here. But looking just at ethnicity, 2-to-1 advantage for Democrats. Among white Catholics, there's a 5-point advantage for Republicans. So together, that's a 41-point swing when you look at the party based upon your race and ethnicity, one. And we see similar differences based upon generation. This is the first election where we'll see more votes cast by Generation Z, Millennials, and Gen X than baby boomers and the silent generation. So paying attention to the generation gap in American politics within the Catholic community is as important, I think, as any other kind of subgroup or topic that we're thinking about.
Carl, really quickly, does any of that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. For years, Democrats and Republicans each had that kind of a cardboard cutout view of Latino voters, right? The Democrats say, oh, well, they're working people, they're poor, Cesar Chavez, they're our kind of liberal, and the Republicans would say, oh, well, but they're family values people. They go to church. They're Roman Catholic. They'll be for us. It's actually a much richer, first of all, it's not all Mexican Americans. It's Puerto Ricans and Central Americans, Mexican Americans. But also, an issue that comes through in the polling they care about intensely is health care. So, abortion, yes, but health care. And so the two political parties have sort of pandered to them in the past. And I think if they pay attention to John's polling, they'll realize this is a more nuanced, they have to have a more nuanced approach.
Like I said, it is very detailed, and that's why we appreciate you guys coming in to break it down for us and giving us what's really going on here. Matthew Bunson, Carl Cannon, John Della Volpe, thank you all so much.
Catholics, especially engaged or active ones, have been a crucial voting bloc in every American presidential election in the last 50 years. 2020 appears to be the same. Our poll finds 53% of American Catholics plan to vote for President Donald Trump or are open to the possibility. More than a third, 34% of those polled, say they are sure they will vote for the president. Again, here's Wyatt Goolsby.
Joining me now is Tim Carney, commentary editor for the Washington Examiner and author of the book Alienated America: Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. Tim, welcome back to the broadcast.
Thank you.
What's your reaction to the percentage of American Catholics who are planning to vote for or open to the possibility of voting for President Donald Trump?
Well, yeah, you've got a third of the country is Trump's base that's with him, and a third of Catholic voters is the same. And then, as with the the rest of the electorate, you've got about 20% that are swinging. And what I see in them, or that are possible, what I see in them is these are people who, A, it depends on how the economy is doing. B, it depends on who Democrats pick as their nominee. And a lot of these people are people who, some of them like what the economy's done, what Trump's done, and don't like him personally. Others tend to be Republicans who usually vote Republican, but then with Trump have specific problems. So it really is going to depend on the campaign. They say in sports, this is why you play the games, this is why you run your campaigns, is for that 20%.
As you had mentioned, at this point, we don't know who the Democratic nominee will be. How much of an influence do you think that will be on that 9% of Catholics who say they could possibly vote for President Trump?
I think it'll be really big. And Joe Biden, by these poll numbers, looks like he might be the strongest. Bernie Sanders does pretty well. Those are the two who are well above 50% among Catholic voters against Trump. And I think the Democrats have dodged a bullet with Kamala Harris dropping out. I think she would have done really poorly among undecided voters, particularly undecided Catholics. So, but Biden and Sanders both really have weaknesses. To do well in early polls does not mean you'll do well in the general election. Both of them are older. Biden has really had sort of senior moments on stage. Sanders is seen as a lovable grandpa, but as more of his policies get dragged out during a campaign, that could drag him down. So that they're doing well early shows that they're likable. How they do under the spotlight with Catholic voters and non-Catholic voters is a different question.
Tim, as I've been talking to a number of different people about this poll, I've noticed there's a difference of opinion expressed on whether there's such thing as a, quote, a Catholic vote in the way that politicians sometimes talk about it. What are your thoughts? Is that an accurate term to use?
Well, I think it's imprecise is what I'll say. On almost all of these questions in this poll, the difference between the Catholic voter and the non-Catholic voter is within the margin of error. Okay, yeah, and even on things you might suspect would be different, whether it has to do with religious liberty or abortion. On the abortion question, on the question, should it be illegal? Yes, Catholics are more likely to say yes, but it doesn't seem to influence their votes. The other detail in this poll, only 40% of the Catholics polled here go to Mass weekly or more. And so when you drill down to that subset, in other polls I've seen, that's where you do see a distinctive behavior, more about being pro-life, more about the Catholic teachings affecting their policies. But if you take the whole universe of Catholics, including the 60% who don't go to Mass every week, then it looks almost exactly like the U.S. electorate as a whole.
Very interesting numbers. In your book, which we have here, Alienated America, you travel throughout the country reporting about the divide between the nation and some of the reasons behind it. Have any of those conditions improved since President Trump came into office?
No, the core problem in the struggling parts of America is that people don't belong to enough things. They're not connected to their neighbors. People don't go to church enough. That's why it's a shuttered church on the front of my book. And I have not seen those things materially turn around, except that sort of a rising economy over the last 3 years has helped some places sort of get back on their feet. So there are really some of these places that are alienated that I looked at in 2015 that are doing a little bit better. But on the whole, you see the opioid problem is getting worse. Suicides are at an all-time high. So we haven't seen a turnaround in the worst parts of the country, but there are some places where you have seen some uplift because of the economy.
I want to ask you about, really quickly, there's an important demographic that we were looking at when it comes to this poll, and that's the younger voters, this generation gap. How important do you think younger voters will be in electing the next president?
It'll be very important, and this is why when Democrats look at a really young guy like Pete Buttigieg, it has this special appeal, because otherwise you've got 3 baby boomers or 2 baby boomers up there on stage. And so the young voters will, they usually don't vote in that high numbers, but every 4 years somebody says, well, this will be the year that the young people come out to vote. I generally bet that it doesn't happen, but Donald Trump has had a big effect of motivating his opponents. So if he motivates the Democratic youth to come out in unprecedented numbers, that could this time be the tipping point.
Well, it's very interesting. Like I said, this poll leads to so many interesting discussions, and we appreciate your coming in to talk about it. Tim Carney, commentary editor for the Washington Examiner and author of Alienated America. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Up next, how voters feel about Christian values in our society.
Welcome back. We're looking at the numbers in our exclusive EWTN News Real Clear Opinion Research polling. Next, Wyatt Goolsbee asks how the Catholic vote compares to the general public and how voters feel about Christian values in our society.
Joining me now are Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at Real Clear Opinion Research, and Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor for EWTN News. Welcome back to all of you. John, let's begin with you. What are some of the areas in the survey where Catholics differ the greatest from the general population?
Well, I think the big issue is what is most important to them? And when they think about voting, and healthcare is the #1 most important issue for the Catholic voter as well as the average American voter as well. So that's clear. That is consistent for Catholics as well as non-Catholics, #1. However, Catholics, there are 3 or 4 issues that really stand apart where Catholics are kind of more engaged and focused on these issues. And they tend to be issues related to the economy. #1, economy, taxes, China trade policy. Those are issues where Catholic voters are more concerned than the average voter. In addition to that, we also see increasing levels of interest for issues related to immigration among the Catholic vote as well.
Very interesting. So Matthew, the survey uniquely drilled down into key aspects of living life as a Catholic.
Yes.
What did you find out about mass attendance, going to confession, and just praying on a regular basis?
Well, we always go back to that 58 percentile group that consider themselves faithful to all or most of the teachings of the Church. When we look at that group, we see that they have 93% pray at least a week. Most of them pray every day. 66% believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. 56% attend Mass at least once a week. 52% go to confession at least once a year. And then there's even a higher level of activity on all of these when you go to that group that firmly adheres to all teachings of the Church. It is a massive drop from that group to those Catholics who say that they accept some of the teachings of the Church, or the group that says, for example, that the Church has very little influence in their lives. So basically what this tells us is that as a church, we have a lot of work to do in terms of formation and catechesis of our faithful.
Yes, because of all those issues are so important, those traditional social conservative issues, for example. So, Carl, according to the poll, huge majority of both general voters, Catholic voters in particular, believe religious values, and specifically those Christian values, should play a more important role in our society. What else did we find out about that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, young people are less likely to answer that question in the affirmative than older voters, which makes you gives you pause. But it also shows you this is still a pretty religious country. It's not the Twitterverse. It's not the secular media out there. And if you've been watching these Democratic presidential debates, the secular nature of it, or even occasionally sort of subtle hostility to religion, makes you think the Democrats may be getting out over their skis a little bit. That's not where the voters are, at least not yet. The other thing I would say about that is that we were talking, Matthew's talking about these active Catholics, and I'd said earlier about how on some issues they mirror evangelical Protestants, and the obvious issue is abortion, and nothing's changed there. And evangelical Protestants have been some of their most prominent evangelical Protestants in this country who worked for George W. Bush have been wringing their hands. Why are evangelicals still staying with President Trump after all the things he's done and said? And it's a fair question, but this data shows that on the issues there's a rationale for it. And on the one issue, abortion, active Catholics and evangelical Protestants are not much different on that abortion. And on this topic, Donald Trump kept his campaign promise, specifically to appoint pro-life federal judges and Supreme Court justices, and he's done that. And so these active Catholics have stayed with him, and what explains it to me is the issues.
So, like you said, you mentioned the issue of abortion, healthcare in general. We've mentioned immigration. Matthew, I also want to ask you about what the findings in the poll talk about the impact of the clergy abuse crisis. Do Catholics approve of the job Pope Francis is doing and the U.S. bishops have been doing on that end?
Well, U.S. Catholics approve by a slim majority, 44 to 41% of the job that Pope Francis has done in handling the sex abuse crisis. He is underwater where the average American is concerned, or Americans overall. The U.S. bishops, however, have about a 55% disapproval rate from Catholics in the United States for how they have handled it. So the perception is out there that the bishops need to do a better job at this. But we're also seeing massive majorities of voters, both Catholic and non-Catholic, that the credibility of the church has been manifestly damaged because of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. And that, too, is something that has to be reckoned with by the U.S. bishops.
And just a reminder again for our viewers to continue to pray for that issue. And like you said, they definitely want action and when continue to voice their opinions, do so. All right, so guys, this wraps up 3 days of our coverage of this Real Clear Politics poll. I want to thank each of you for coming in and breaking this down with us. This survey is so important, not just for the upcoming election, but also to talk about the issues within the church as well. So Matthew Bunson, John Della Volpe, Carl Cannon, thank you all so much for your time.
And to see the full results of the poll, or if you missed any of our discussions this month, visit EWTNnews.com/poll. We thank you so much for watching tonight. I'm Jason Calvi. We'll see you again on Monday. Good night and God bless.